Right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Alan Levine. This is the Political Theory Institute conversation with Stephen Macedo of Princeton University. Before we get to that, I just want to quickly talk about the ground rules. We will have a conversation for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll take Q&A. To ask your questions, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom at the bottom, and please state your name and identify your affiliation. We do, by custom, take questions from students first, so students start thinking now. I do want to mention that we have 3 more events this semester. On March 8th, we have a roundtable on the life and times of Gertrude Himmelfarb, who was a great moral historian and died a year ago. The panelists on that will be Bill Crystal, Matt Continetti, Jerry Muller, and Samuel Moyne. On April 1st, we have Remy Bragg, one of Europe's leading philosophers. And on April 15th, Roosevelt Montas of Columbia University on democratizing the great books. So keep an eye out for those. We hope to see you then as well. For today, Steve, I just want to say it's a great pleasure having you here today. You were my very first speaker at American University 25 years ago to the week. Back
Seems
then,
like only yesterday.
Yeah, I know, me too. Back then afterwards, all I could do was take you out for a beer afterwards. Now with Zoom, I can't even offer you anything, but you'll get a little something from us in the mail. But we've come a long way since then with this great program, as you've seen. A lot of people helped me do this. My colleagues, Tom Merrill, Sarah Hauser, Borden Flanagan, Gabe Whitbread, and all the people in the SPA communications team. So thank you to you all. Our topic today, or let me start with your bio before we get into the topic. And because you are very distinguished. Steve Macedo is the Nelson Rockefeller Professor of Politics at the University. Yeah, what's the difference among Rockefellers? And the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University. He writes and teaches on political theory, ethics, public policy, and law, especially on topics related to liberalism, democracy and citizenship, diversity and civic education, religion and politics, and the family and sexuality. From 2001 to 9, he was director of Princeton's Center for Human Values, and as the founding director of Princeton's program in law and public affairs, he chaired the Princeton Project on Universal Jurisdiction, helped formulate the Princeton Principles on Universal Jurisdiction, and edited Universal Jurisdiction, International Courts, and the Prosecution of Serious Crimes under International Law. As vice president of the American Political Science Association, he was first chair of its Standing Committee on Civic Education and Engagement and principal co-author of Democracy at Risk: How Political Choices Undermine Citizen Participation and What We Can Do About It. His other books include Just Married, Same-Sex Couples, Monogamy and the Future of Marriage, Diversity and Distrust, Civic Education in a Multicultural Democracy, and Liberal Virtues, Citizenship, Virtue, and Community in Liberal Constitutionalism. He's also the co-author and co-editor of American Constitutional Interpretation with W.F. Murphy and J.E. Fleming and S.A. Barber. He's the current president of the American Society for Political and Legal Philosophy, which publishes the annual Nomos volumes, and he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2014. You've done a lot of bureaucratic work, Steve, founding organizations, institutions. Congratulations. Good work. And he's currently working on a book on justice and migration, which is the theme of our topic today. After the backlash, populism, I forgot the title, populism,
and the politics,
immigration, populism, and liberal nationalism. And Steve, so one of the things that I've always liked about your work is that even while striving to articulate justice and the good, you insist on a hard-headed sense of reality. And I've been at conferences, and I know you have been too, where justice-inspired theorists try to outdo each other and strive for a level of purity in their conceptions that increasingly become utopian and go off into la la land. I was at a conference one time where the speaker said she didn't recognize reality as a legitimate objection to her theory. So I know reality can be changed, but in any case, one of the things that I've always liked about you is the kind of hard-headedness, right? And so I want to begin with a line from one of your essays where you talk about possible limits to all the things that liberal thinkers might want, and that trade-offs might be necessary. So I'd like to read back to you this line and maybe ask you to explain what you see as the tensions and possible trade-offs. Those with liberal sensibilities need to consider whether everything that they might favor, humanitarian concern for the world's poor, and openness to an ever-widening social diversity, and support for distributive justice within our political community necessarily go together, right? So there are clearly tensions between those things. What do you see as the tensions?
Well, first of all, Alan, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be back. And one thing I'd say is that there's a tension within our political morality, leaving aside the hard-headedness, just from the standpoint of justice, social justice within the political community and what we owe to human beings more generally, from a moral standpoint. I think there can be a tension in principle, and then we need to explore it in practice. And that is, I do agree with those who argue that we have special obligations within a political community towards our fellow citizens, and that the setting within which distributive justice, social justice is set is the political community. And that we have different obligations, duties to outsiders of a humanitarian sort, and others that flow from the particular relationships we have with them, if they're trading relationships or mutual involvement in things like climate change and so on. Obviously, have duties to contribute to that, and also to do our fair share of taking refugees and so on. But they're different in content, what we owe to human beings simply, or what we owe to human beings in other kinds of relationships, to what we owe to our fellow citizens. So in the first instance, I would want to say that as a matter of principle, and even from the standpoint of political morality, I'm with those liberals and social democrats who think that citizenship matters. It doesn't just matter from a hard-headed realist standpoint, but it matters from a moral standpoint because of the relationship that we share as citizens of a self-governing community. So this is where, in a way, Michael Walzer developed this kind of an argument in Spheres of Justice, and then to surprise extent, John Rawls converged with it to some extent, at least in some of his work, and David Miller and others, my colleague Anna Stilts, Michael Blake, and there are a number of people that take this view. There are many that take a far more cosmopolitan view and want to universalize these relationships, or see the relationships of social justice as global. But in the first instance, there are tensions that exist within political morality, and in a way from the standpoint of justice and human rights, rather than from the standpoint of realism. Realism does then lead to other worries about stability and so on.
So even before we go into the realism, then, why do you think we have special obligations to our fellow citizens as opposed to the same universal obligations to every human being, no matter where they might live?
Right. So that's because it does seem to me that as members of a sort of comprehensively, collectively self-governing community, where we regulate each other's fate from cradle to grave as citizens of a sovereign political community, we owe it to our fellow citizens to justify the way we use that considerable power, the way that we shape the institutions that we're all subject to, the coercive institutions, the institutions that could draft your children my children, everyone's children, to fight and die for the country. We impose mandatory vaccinations, we impose mandatory education requirements, we impose all sorts of coercive laws, and we impose property regimes, and we protect certain forms of property, and we bail out banks and financial institutions in the wake of financial crises, using everyone's resources. And we do these things as well in the face of things like COVID epidemic and so on. So we are members of a highly consequential set of political institutions which shape our lives from cradle to grave and beyond, because they shape estates and trusts and early childhood health, mother's health before even children are born. So it's a highly consequential set of relationships we have, and I think principles that require the fair sharing of the benefits of this highly consequential form of community that we share, economic community, political community, and social community, are the principles of social justice, and they're the principles that ought to be used to design those institutions. So they're institutionally dependent principles, you could put it that way. And that's the basic view of social democrats and egalitarian liberals. Not so much some classical liberals and libertarians who go wrong in various other ways, but that's the principled argument. It's that these relationships we have are consequential, and we have special, I put it, there was justificatory obligations to justify ourselves to our fellow citizens in a way that's a bit different from what we have to outsiders who we don't govern. I think what we ought to be doing with respect to outsiders is helping them get into their own self-governing communities and then engage in fair cooperation of various sorts with them and mutual aid. But being a member of a political community is a morally significant relationship that people have to one another, and social justice, principles of justice, are the principles that make that relationship fair to everyone who's involved, by protecting everyone's basic liberties and then making sure that the system of rewards can be justified to everybody within the system. That's the aspiration of principles of social justice.
Okay. Now, before we go on with the theory, today the Biden administration released its immigration bill on day one of the Biden administration. They said they were going to do it, and here it comes. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about just immediate politics. I don't know if you know it, but American university students are consistently rated the most politically active, or among the most politically active students in the country by your own institution's Princeton review. So
and it must be true.
Yeah, it is. So what do you know about the bill that was released today? You got it in your hand, or a copy of it? Or
I just have the summary that you mentioned, and it's from one of the news sites. I don't have all the details. It just lists several, actually, sort of three initial planks, and there's got to be more to it than that. But first, creating a task force to reunify families. This child separation policy, presumably undoing that and trying to reunite the families that were separated. That obviously is an incredible moral priority. It's horrible to separate children from their parents in the way that was done. Secondly, to develop a strategy to address irregular migration across the southern border and create a humane asylum system. That again is a moral imperative. We have duties under a refugee law to process claims appropriately, and we haven't been doing that for some time. And then the third plank is to restore faith in our legal immigration system and promote integration of new Americans. Now, I don't know the details on that. All I would say is that reunifying families is obviously hugely important. Oh, the other part of it, I'm sorry, that's there in the bill is an 8-year path to regularization for undocumented migrants. I think that's perhaps part of that last plank. And those things are all good, very good things to do, and very morally urgent, for the reasons that I mentioned.
So one of the things that I saw, so the 8-year path to citizenship, that's for undocumented people in the country today, or as of
Right.
January 1st, I think it
Right.
was. But there's two exceptions to that: the dreamers and the farm workers. And they are going to be given, from what I read, immediate temporary status. That so it's the equivalent, I think, of a green card, right? And then so that 3 years from now they would be able to become full citizen. And it also seems to be increasing the numbers of immigrants being admitted on a diversity basis, and giving an unlimited number, what I saw, of spots to family reunifications on a diversity basis. So considerably more liberal than the 2013 immigration bill by the so-called Gang of Eight.
Well, the Gang of Eight and all of the Democrats,
Yeah.
that 2013 immigration bill was supported by every Democrat in the Senate and President Obama. But the 8 Republicans went along with it and pushed it over the top. I also read that, and I don't know. The United States already has the most, as I understand it, and I've actually been working on other things at the moment, though I've been chipping away at this book on immigration as well. The United States already has the most extensive family-based immigration preferences of any country in the world. So I'm not sure what's involved in that. There are some limits. So I'm just not. I'm not sure exactly what that entailed. As far as the dreamers go, these were people who were brought here as children, and indeed, among the undocumented, very many of them have been here for more than 5 years. Can't remember the percentage now, but it's more than half. And actually, many have been here for more than 10 years. So the costs of not integrating people are extremely large. The vast majority of the undocumented are people that have been here for quite a long time, who are part of our community. There would be some limitations on people that had committed serious crimes, but there's a profound, I think, obligation to regularize the status of these people who live under threat of deportation and are vulnerable to exploitation of all kinds on the job site, maybe afraid to report crimes. I think the main pushback here is a political one, that they felt that probably people feel that they would be more likely to register as Democrats than Republicans. So I don't know, maybe there has to be a limitation, on naturalization or something. But morally speaking, these folks, the vast majority of them should be regularized as soon as possible. I think the limitations there are political. I would also say that I think countries do have a right to regulate their borders, and I can understand people wanting to control and to make collective decisions about migration, and doing that in reasonable ways should be something that we're able to do.
Yeah, so just in terms of the politics of this, I know in the 2013 Gang of Eight bill, it proposed building 700 miles of border fencing,
Yeah.
border wall with Mexico, right? So Trump made that a big, huge issue, built much less than 700 miles. I see reports of 400 miles, but a lot of that is apparently rebuilding old wall and not new wall. But this new proposal today says nothing about walls. And
Right.
I'm guessing that the idea of wall has been so poisoned to the Democratic electorate after Trump's playing that issue up, that it's sort of a non-starter. But that means that the Democrats and the Republican Party seem to be quite far apart on all of this. And I don't know, I see it as an opening salvo and not something that they're really expecting to pass.
I suspect that's correct. Can I share my screen? Is it, because I actually have what you just said on a PowerPoint slide. I think I can. Let me see if I can do it. Oops, I'll pull this back here. Sorry, I think I have the power. Let me see, does this, oops. Is that visible now?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, that's you warned me about this. So I did put in the 2013 immigration compromise bill that, as you said, was supported by every Senate Democrat, 8 Republicans, and President Obama. That included $46 billion increase for border security, 20,000 personnel, 700 miles of wall. But also this e-verify system to prevent the employment or deter the employment of undocumented workers. That's a much more humane way of doing it. It puts the burden on employers, rather than border security. And a lot of people, most people support that, I think. And it does allow for the country to exert control over, who's here in a documented way. We also need to have, reasonable paths of entry, legal entry. But that also involved curtailing family preferences and the diversity lottery, and moving towards more skills-based immigration, as the Canadians and others have. That bill favored young, educated, experienced, skilled migrants fluent in English. I noticed that this current bill also talks about investing in integration, and then it did provide regularization of most of the status, with the 11 million on a 10-year basis. So in terms of the politics of all this, whether this is an opening salvo for further negotiation, I guess will remain to be seen.
Yeah. Okay. So to step back to sort of the larger issue after the backlash, right? The backlash, I assume, is Trumpism, right? To immigration.
Trump, Brexit, right? I was trying to think about the populist backlash more broadly, but yeah.
Okay, right, good. So there's 3 different sort of time periods that I'd like to talk to you about here. So first would be the immigration policy until recently, or until up through now, maybe, right? Going back to 1965, I think is where it starts.
Right.
And that sets the pattern that the backlash is a backlash too. Right. And then let's talk about the backlash and the nature of that and what's going on with that. And then third, maybe going forward, is there a path forward?
Right.
Okay. So let's just talk about immigration policy since 1965 in the US. Can you just sort of characterize that for us?
Yeah, and I may have a slide on this also. It put an end to the national origins quotas, which were straightforwardly racial and ethnically based. I think I can share this again here, if that comes up. Which were put into place in the 1920s, which there were you probably don't want. I'm probably anticipating your next question, but there were a whole series of immigration restrictions that were put in place in the early 20th century. This put an end to them and established family reunification as a central principle, and those family reunification principles, along with some other shifts in migration policy, but including family reunification as a central policy, included not only adult migrant spouses and children, but the adult migrants' parents, adult siblings, their spouses, their children, and so on. And once admitted, their spouses' parents, their siblings, their siblings' children, and so on and so forth. So since 1965, 65% of U.S. immigration migrants getting permanent residency have been based on family preferences. And as I said before,
that's the so-called chain migration.
It's also referred
Trump
to as chain migration,
about, right?
Yeah. Yes. And I think it's agreed to by scholars. I believe it's the case that no other country has such extensive family preferences to extended family members. And it's also the case, as of quotations from Ted Kennedy, who was one of the sponsors of the bill, that the consequences were not anticipated. That at least it seems to be the case that they thought that this would remove the pretty much explicit racial and ethnic quotas from the law, but not have a significant impact on immigration. It did eventually lead to large increases in immigration that were not anticipated. And I would say about this that this may be a sensible policy. There are reasons for keeping families together, even extended families. They can be sort of welfare networks and good for children and so on. I don't think these extensive family-based preferences, especially now that travel is easier, I don't think they're required by justice. So I think they are eligible for reconsideration. So I
And
think
when you say not required by justice, you mean that people can fly over and visit. It's not like saying goodbye forever,
yeah,
and that's
yeah,
enough.
yeah, and
And they
I
can
just
talk
don't
on the
think,
phone
yeah,
and
it's not, it's
Zoom.
right, it's not a violation of human rights, and it's not a violation of justice and migration to say to people, you can apply to join our country. You have a right to bring your spouse and your children, but you don't have a right to bring your parents. You don't have special preferences to, if you're an adult, to bring your adult siblings and their spouses and so on. So yeah, no, I don't think it's this may be the best policy that we have uniquely in the world. It may be, and it's I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it seems to me it's eligible for reconsideration within the bounds of justice.
Okay. And so, but as a result of this policy, and this is just the facts, the data.
Yeah.
So in 1970, something like 4.7% of Americans were foreign born. And by 2018, it was 13.7. So basically a tripling of the foreign born population as a percentage. You have this here
You
too.
can see it up there now. You read my papers, so I have some of these slides. Yes, they're going to think we really coordinated this. Go ahead, but yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
Go ahead. So explain the slide.
That's true, and there are other. I mean, there's the numbers. Now this goes much further back. Immigration in orange as a percentage of the U.S. population. You can see how it dips in the 20th century there after these early 20th century reforms, and then goes back up again. And the number of migrants, well, the population's gotten much larger as well. That includes, that includes migrants and their children. But yeah, so these 1965 immigration reforms did lead to large and apparently more or less unintended increases in both the numbers and the percentage of migrants in the country. And there was a specific distributive impact with respect to the labor force, which was much debated because of the long border we share with Mexico and proximity of countries to our south. The migrants overwhelmingly came in at the lower end of the skills set in terms of the labor force. And George Borjas has been the leading person here who's argued that it contributed to the lowering of wages among those with only a high school degree or high school dropouts. It seems very likely that he exaggerated that effect, and probably migration net with respect to wages, it's disputed highly, but it's probably had a modest negative effect, not a huge negative effect. On the other hand, you could say Canadians have pursued the opposite immigration policy than we have since the 60s. They've had skills-based immigration, which is to say they've tended to introduce people into the labor force at the higher skills level. And that has arguably the opposite distributive impact of perhaps tending to lower wages among the skilled and pull wages up among the less skilled portions of the labor force. This is a bit overly simplified and it may not be quite that simple, but it's at least arguable that the Canadian policies have helped to lessen economic inequality, Canadian migration policies, and perhaps also have made it easier for them to do multiculturalism of various sorts, so they have their own tensions up there.
Right. Whereas our policies have led to increasing inequality.
Somewhat, if you depending on how much you buy Borjas in this labor market argument. I mean, there'll be some other effects as well that people talk about. I think it has to be said. I think it's like I said. I think it's probably made a contribution, not the main contribution. If we're thinking about the flatlining of working class wages since the 1970s, the early 70s, maybe the main effects there would be globalization and automation, for sure. But immigration may have contributed a bit. I mean, the way that Borjas puts it is we more or less doubled the number of high school dropouts in the population by virtue of these policies. Now, native high school dropouts and migrant high school dropouts are not perfect substitutes for one another, and there are some labor economists who argued that actually they might be complementary, because those with language skills and so on, native, may actually benefit from the presence of So it's complicated. There's a fiscal impact on local governments that has been an issue as well, and there's some arguments about stereotyping in the workplace and undocumented workers perhaps lowering the work conditions because they're eligible for exploitation by employers. So I think there's probably been some negative impact there, not huge, less than Borjas has argued.
Okay, and in addition to those economic consequences, you also talk about political and social consequences in terms of feelings of solidarity amongst our citizenry.
Yeah, I mean, the two, I think I'll stop sharing here for the moment, but the two sort of aspects of that would be one, sort of Robert Putnam's research coming out of his article, E Pluribus Unum, from about 2008, I think it was. I was going to try to stop sharing, but I don't seem to be able to. From about 2008, I think it was. Oh, there we are. Okay, great. And the subsequent research on that. There's been a huge amount of subsequent research about the conditions under which his argument about hunkering down holds. What he found there was that increasing racial and ethnic diversity tends to reduce social trust, and another research has said reduce social goods provision, at least temporarily. And that it leads to less trust, not just of out-group members, but of in-group members as well, so that people become less trusting as a general matter, not just less trusting of the outsiders. Subsequent research has shown, Abascal and Baldessari and others, that this is mainly a white majority effect, that there's little or no evidence that it reduces social trust among minority group members, among whom it's already lower, but it may reduce social trust among the majority living in a more diverse society. That's a perfectly plausible qualification of Putnam's thesis. And there are other qualifications out there too. It's hotly contested, but I also read this literature as suggesting a plausible ground for thinking that there might be a contributor. Increasing racial and ethnic diversity that's immigration-based might be a contributor to increased levels of distrust and possibly reduced levels of social provision.
Yeah, and that's important because you talk about in one of your papers on immigration, the amount of trust in the New Deal, and you cite a decent amount of scholarship that suggests that, or at least raises the question, that the New Deal might not have been possible with so much diversity, or at least it was underpinned by people feeling a kind of solidarity to the people who were here now, and they weren't worried about all sorts of other people coming in, let alone without authorization. And so that enabled them to say, okay, people are hurting, I can give, I can sacrifice, and feel that solidarity.
Right. So this partly comes out, though, the stuff you're talking about that I wrote about is before Putnam's recent book, The Upswing, but he talks about this there again too, about various indices of social well-being starting to go down in 1965, having been quite high for the previous 3 or 4 decades. But the book, I'll share the screen again, that I draw on in arguing this. So I think there's some of this elsewhere, including in some others, but Jefferson Cowie's the great exception, The New Deal and the Limits of American Politics. He points out that the Immigration Acts of 1917, 18, 21, and 24 cut immigration by 85% and virtually ended immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, make sure you keep those Jews out.
Well, that's absolutely Jews and Germans and Italians and others. But there's no question. I mean, this is in the realm of dilemma for sure, not a justification by any stretch of the imagination. But argues that tensions between native-born and immigrant, long and deeply embedded in American politics, was temporarily relieved. And so when the 1929 crash hit, nativism was largely at bay. This in itself was enough to engender more of a sense of unity among working people than before. The mitigation of the nativist impulse helped shape an age of greater equality. So he says, crucial to the success of the New Deal was the cessation of nativism associated with immigration. And just as you were saying, Alan, the unintended result of a conservative immigration policy was the cohesion necessary for the most liberal period in American history. So that is an interesting. Gonna get rid of this stuff here. Yeah.
I've always heard the discussions of the immigration, the ending of immigration bills in the 20s that you were just pointing to as, one of the sort of sins of the progressive era, right up there with eugenics, because it was clearly driven by a kind of racism, but it did seem to have the benefit of leading to a kind of social solidarity within the country. And so now I want to turn away from sort of the immigration policy to the backlash, right? And so to what extent is the backlash against that large immigration that we've had since 1965, the second largest wave of immigration, second only to the 1890s in our national history, to what's driving that backlash? To what extent is it racist? To what extent is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, the recent work on this by political scientists, I mean, and I've tried to look at, the various grounds for thinking that there are, substantive concerns here. And I don't think it's completely crazy to think that there are some substantive concerns of the sorts that we've talked about with wage effects and fiscal burden on local governments, not the national level, but that and the social trust stuff. But nevertheless, and I've got some of the books stacked behind me here by Sides, Tesler, and Vavrick, and Abrahano and Hajnal, and so on, suggests that at least if you focus on those white working class voters who shifted from having voted for Obama to voting for Trump, that it was the members of those groups who were most hostile on grounds of to immigrants and to African Americans and Muslims, so racialized hostility and racialized resentment.
But yet they voted for Obama twice.
Yet they voted for Obama twice, but they were the Obama voters among those groups with high levels of racialized resentment, and they voted for Obama in the context of the alternative being Mitt Romney or John McCain, who did not deploy the kinds of rhetoric that Trump did. So what this book shows, Sides, Tesler, and Vavrick, and Abrahano and Hajnal, and I think there's some of it there in the Scotch, Poll, and Williamson book, and other things as well, and you can find this in the UK also, is that there were these anti-immigration sentiments that have been there for a while, and Trump tapped into them. They were not tapped into by previous Republican presidents. Let's put it, the successful Republican candidates. They were, of course, by Buchanan, Patrick Buchanan, but he was torpedoed by the Republican elite when they put Bob Dole, in order to prevent Buchanan from winning, and they rallied behind Dole. They were not able, the Republican elites were not able to do that with Trump, and so he played into these sentiments big time and activated them and energized them. So that does seem to be the main. Now you could say, there were other conditions as well. Part of the condition was the flatlining of these wages, the fact that white working class wages have been stagnant or even decline in real terms, depending on how you look at it, from the 1970s. That is part of the context as well. But if you look at what moved individuals, it was not the ones that were most economically vulnerable among the working class. It was the ones with the highest levels of racialized resentment and hostility towards immigrants, Mexican immigrants in particular, and African Americans also, and Muslims. Now, some of it does try to complicate it. There's some of the research suggests, I think it's in Abrahano and Hajnal, says that, well, if you correct people's information with respect to Mexican immigrants, that they tend to associate Mexican immigration with undocumented immigration, and if you correct that, then a lot of the hostility towards Mexican migration goes away. So it's not so there. The hostility towards Mexican migration is really kind of a surrogate for, is at least partly about undocumented migration. that may be. There's, part of this undoubtedly is, and this is, very strong in the Scotchwell and Williamson book on Tea Party voters, these sentiments are also being pressed by the right-wing media environment. So lots and lots of stories in the media about Mexican migrants committing crimes and so on, way beyond the actual incidence of crimes. There's some reports in some of these works about the number of news stories or the proportion of news stories that involve Mexican migration, of Mexican migrants or undocumented migrants or even legal migrants. A very high proportion of the stories in the press about this category of people have to do with crimes that they've committed. So you get this unbalanced, distorted reporting that has the effect of fanning some of these hostilities. So that's undoubtedly been part of what's gone on here and what's contributed to it as well.
But you also talk about qualitative studies, right? And one of the things that's nice about your work is you're looking at, you're a real good political scientist, looking at quantitative data and qualitative.
Not what my colleagues say.
To supplement it, and the qualitative data suggests some other things about the importance of, less importance about race per se and more about protecting local communities.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Oops, and I've just messed up my screen here a little bit. Yeah, and we just talked about that paper with your students. I have, one of the things I've been struck by in the because I do think that actually, with respect to this whole backlash issue and the crisis of democratic politics at the moment, I mean, there are interesting philosophical questions there and interesting theoretical questions there, but I do have to say, and maybe this is a kind of being treasonous to my own subfield, but a lot of the most interesting questions are empirical. What the heck is going on? It is interesting that one of the things I've been struck by in a lot of this literature are the different valences in the accounts of Trump's working class voters in the survey literature and in the ethnographic literature, to put it that way. This is no news to your colleagues, but including Kathy Kramer's book, The Politics of Resentment, the Arlie Hochschild book, the Scotchwell and Williamson book on Tea Party Republicans, and a recent book that provoked my sort of thinking about this more by Moravchik and Shields, John Shields and I'm forgetting Moravchik's first name, Stephanie Moravchik, called Trump's Democrats, another ethnographic, and Robert Withnow's The Left Behind. But you get much more sympathetic accounts of people. So, I mean, the one thing that has worried me a little bit about the survey research is that it may have kind of the effect of reducing people, insofar as it makes us think about them in a certain way, think about Trump voters in a certain way, think about Trump's working class voters in a certain way. That the description in the survey research emphasizing the racialized hostilities has the tendency of reducing people to that, in a way, reducing people to their worst aspect. And it does seem to me that in a democratic society that's highly polarized like ours, one thing that's crucial is to try to understand people on the other side sympathetically. And that it's a requirement of academics like us to, well, of course, survey researchers want to understand what moved this swath of voters, these 9% of Obama voters, to vote for Trump. What was the factor? Of course, that's very important. But when we're talking about people and how we should regard them, I do think that these more three-dimensional accounts that we get in the ethnographic work, of course, they're explicitly intended to make them seem more sympathetic, and they do have that effect. So partly I've been playing around, it's partly that does seem to be they get cast as people who themselves have a localist orientation. Withnow presents them that way in The Left Behind. Moravchik and Shields do that as well in some of the other works, that they're localists in their orientation. And there may be something to that. It's some stuff I need to develop, but I do think that that sympathetic understanding across these divides is something that we desperately need in our politics, something that's desperately missing from the media environment. And and can be desperately missing from our conversations on campuses, which are also often quite polarized, with conservative students, for example, being inhibited, feeling quite inhibited and fearful about speaking up on particular issues. That itself is a worry to me. So that exploration of Trump voters as localists, which I'm still sort of working through, seeing them as localist in their orientation. It was partly an attempt to sort of cast them sympathetically and to understand them sympathetically in terms of their local communities, which is what some of those ethnographic works are trying to do.
Yeah, well, it's really important to understand the other side, especially fellow citizens on the other side, if there's going to be some kind of solution, if we're going to come together and find some way of life, common life, some reparation of divisions.
Compromise legislation, legislation involving compromise, right?
Yeah, we've got to find out what we share, and that begins with understanding each other. And at the Political Theory Institute here, we're all about that, trying to get all sorts of different points of views.
Good, yeah.
So I want to remind people to, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A feature. We're going to go now to the sort of the third period that I want to talk about, for what's to be done. Right. And then after that, we'll turn to the Q&A. And you mentioned a minute ago something that everybody feels all the time, that we are really polarized as a nation, right? More and more all the time. But yet with immigration, it leads to, a kind of diversity that's not simply polarized, right? It's all sorts of different groups and different ways of life, right? So how do we get from, to the extent that immigration is relevant to our polarization, right? How do we get from the sort of the wild diversity that we've had since 1965 to polarization?
I'm not sure how much immigration itself has been a contributor to polarization, probably somewhat. I don't have any special expertise on the subject of polarization, which political scientists have said quite a lot about. Obviously, the realignment of the parties post civil rights, the southernization of the Republican Party, and the much cleaner ideological splits that didn't exist in the past, and other factors. Some of it maybe news media, but some of it also just generational changes taking place with before the Cold War's gone away, and so on. Immigration again, might contribute it somewhat with respect to increasing diversity, and diversity is a good thing, but it can lead to some social tensions. Here we're in the range of prudence and not principle. At what point do we think that? People will use the language of absorption, and how what is society's capacity to absorb newcomers, given economic and other conditions, and maintain a sense of social solidarity. I don't know the algorithm for that. I don't know exactly what the answer is. It is the case that in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, when immigration was also high, we've approached those levels in recent years. There was also this big backlash. There were also economic tensions back then, and things that led to this, great inequality developing as well. So I do think that that high levels of immigration can be a stress factor, which figure in along with other things, and create stresses in a country, which are problematic, just given that while morally speaking we have these obligations that I mentioned at the beginning, flowing from our shared relationship as citizens, those moral reasons and moral relations don't automatically generate the moral motivation and sense of mutuality and shared fate and mutual identification that we count on for people to actually support public goods provision and social redistribution. So I do think that high rates of immigration may contribute. That may depend on exactly, you know, the class levels of migrants. There's some research out there that suggests that, you know, that more skilled immigration, immigration coming from more skilled countries may not have the same stress factors. Again, the Canadians to some extent may have had less issue with this, not just because of volumes of immigration, but because of the composition of the immigrant pool. So there are complicated issues here, but I have worried a bit about immigration contributing to these social stressors and being social stressors on the solidarity that we depend upon for to support redistribution and to support social provision.
Yeah, and I think you read a phrase from the summary of the Biden bill about integration, integrating immigrants, and it raises the question of, from your point of view, what should be the goal? Should our goal be fostering diversity in and of itself, or fostering a liberal community where we have shared principles? Both? I mean, seems like it's a both, but you know, how do we put that together?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
the
liberal
shape the diversity into a one. That's what we seem to be lacking.
Yeah. And again, I don't know that I have any special insights here, but you know, I think people want to learn the language and should be helped to learn the language for sure. That nothing precludes them, and it's a good thing to keep their own languages as well. And with time, people do learn the language. That's important for economic integration and political integration. So that's fine. And I you know,
so English in schools, you're in favor of that?
Yeah, I think everybody's in favor of that. The question is bilingualism, and I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not gonna hold forth on that. I mean, people learning English is one thing. People not continuing to speak the other languages is a different thing. But obviously we should be helping people to you know, to integrate economically and become part of the community, their local communities. And I think people typically want to do that. So it should be more a matter of providing support for that and encouragement. And that does seem to be part of the Biden plan. And I think that would attract bipartisan support. Economic integration is also important, and that's, you know, that's a tricky one, especially at the moment. But there's some huge changes taking place. The biggest source of migration for the last couple of decades, several decades, has been Mexico, but migration from Mexico is basically zero now. The birth rates in Mexico are changed enormously. Family sizes are much smaller than they used to be, and the Mexican economy has also progressed. So there's been net out migration of people from Mexico, I believe, some immigration as well. So the big issue we seem to be facing at the moment with respect to the border has to do with not workers so much as families with children who are fleeing disorder. And you know, the Trump response to that was to cut aid to Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador and places, which was a bad idea, because we should be trying to promote greater stability and greater development there. People would rather not leave, but they're facing terrible disorder. And there are then vexing questions having to do with our responsibility for some of that disorder. It's some very difficult questions, some having to do with American drug laws and drug policies, and also the influence of people that have returned from the United States and formed drug cartels and so on, and gangs in these countries that helps promote an instability. But we do need to try to promote greater stability in those countries so that people don't feel like they have to flee, women and children and families, which is the principal thing we're facing now. And refugee law is quite different from immigration law and requirements.
Yeah, so I think refugees account for about 15% of the immigrants coming to the country since 1965, and those with economic skills that are needed, another 15%, right? something like that. It's been about 2/3 family reunification and so-called diversity, and the other third is split between refugees and economic skills. So moving forward, what's the kind of policy you want? What are our obligations to the poor and the miserable around the world, and what needs to be done for the poor within our own country, whether they be African American or the white working class that's hollowed out in the Rust Belt?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not I'm not going to offer my set of golden prescriptions for, but look, I mean, we do have moral obligations towards those, and we've signed refugee conventions and commitments that commit us to taking, I think, our fair share of refugees from around the world. We've also contributed to some degree in some places to the generation of refugees, both through our contributions to climate change, which can lead to climate refugees. And as I said, also past American policies in Central America, CIA involvement with governments and so on, that helped to contribute, not been the sole cause, but helped to contribute to economic instability. So, I mean, we should return to more generous levels of refugee resettlement, of at least the Obama years and probably more. And like I said, that's the main issue. And then we should also be doing what we can to contribute to greater stability in Central America, where there's tremendous instability and economic and civil dislocation at the moment.
What about guest worker programs?
Yeah, there are real pluses and minuses. Guest workers, I mean, in principle, I think I'm not as hostile to them as some of my colleagues. They can work well. I spent a couple of weeks in the United Arab Emirates, which is obviously kind of a unique place, fantastically wealthy. Most of the guest workers there seem to be extremely happy with it, but there are many others that have been exploited by middlemen, and there are like 1 million people who are just sort of languishing there because they can't afford to pay the middlemen who brought them over. So the problem with guest workers is they're kind of rife with opportunities for exploitation, and they're very vulnerable. But they can remittances certainly make large contributions to economic growth in poorer countries. And if you could make guest worker program work well, then I'd be in favor of it. The problem is it can be very, very hard to make them work well. Involvement of home states can be quite important. But that's probably not going to be a huge part of what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I don't have any special insights on how to boost working class wages or deal with not just the effects of globalization, but automation. But we do need to think about ways of restoring and bolstering work that gives meaning to people in their lives and a decent income. But I'll leave it to others to specify exactly how that should be done.
And what about sort of emulating our neighbors to the north and have a greater emphasis on skills-based immigration?
Yeah, I mean that can be good, and there are pluses and minuses. There's worry about brain drains, and we would have to be careful about that to make it sort of morally justifiable that we're not exploiting countries by siphoning off their limited numbers of healthcare workers who they've invested in locally. There's some real worries about that. On the other hand, there's research that suggests that kind of migration can increase the returns to education and increase people's incentives to train for skills. So the one thing I think about that kind of policy is that it probably would be good for us, as it's been for other countries, but we should make sure that it's also good for the sending country and not exploiting them and not draining off needed educated workers who they need for development. So if we can, it might be a good thing for us, and we've already moved, I think, a bit in that direction. But we should try to make sure it's not exploiting developing countries, and that they're benefiting as well.
Okay, I have one last question, and then we'll turn to audience questions. So audience members, please send them in to the Q&A function. And this is tangentially related, but you mentioned the media stirring up people's views, and the media, of course, is a lot larger issue than immigration per se,
Yeah.
right? And given um, you know, to what extent does the media need policing, and
Yeah.
by whom, right? So recently, we've allowed the social media platforms to do the policing and decide whose accounts get cut off and whose don't. Um, is that a good way to go? Should there be a national discussion about this and some laws about it? What do you think about that?
Yeah, again, I mean, I, like everybody else, I think are very concerned about this. Maybe this issue of Section 2340, I can't remember what the number is, the question of liability of media companies for disinformation that's put on their platforms, making them more liable for falsehoods and for libelous statements and so on, would be part of it. I certainly would be open to that idea. I know it's being pushed by both Senator Warren and some Republicans too. The Australian initiative to try to get some companies like Facebook and Google to pay for news generation, which they're otherwise just passing along without contributing to the cost, also seems like a good thing. I don't. I think it's hugely important. I taught John Stuart Mills on liberty in an undergraduate seminar this past week, and the faith that's also in Justice Brandeis's opinions in Whitney versus California, and some of the pivotal seminal free speech opinions that truth will win out in the marketplace of ideas. You read those things now, and likewise in Mill, and you just think to yourself, wow, we don't have that sort of confidence now, and there's no particular reason for it. I mean, all of those defenses of free speech from the past, not all of them, but many of them did suppose that the infrastructure of the public sphere was such that good news would tend to drive out bad, that it was, that the whole thing was tilted in the direction of truth. And I just think that there is reason to doubt that now, for sure. Yes, just as you said, when I saw those big photographs in the New York Times of Mark Zuckerberg and what's his name with the Irish name from Twitter, Jack Dorsey, they're the ones that took Trump off Twitter and Facebook. Well, I applauded them like everybody else, but is that who we're going to depend upon, to make sure that that our public infrastructure of communication tends towards the truth? I mean, in the past, of course, there were lots of scurrilous newspapers and tracts, and I was talking to a friend the other night about early Republic, in which those scurrilous stories were published in partisan newspapers about political candidates and so on, and of course the passing of the Sedition Act and so on. It's not new that newspapers can print lies, and media environments can print lies, but I think there was a period we went through with a high level of professionalism, and at least we had the sense that overall public discussion would tend in the direction of the truth, and I think there is reason to worry about that now. So, and I do worry about it. So exactly how we go about fixing that, I don't know. But as you say, I think there should be a public debate about it. I've been concerned, like many people have, of Yochai Benkler's book, Network Propaganda on the Right-Wing Media Environment seems part of it. But the old fairness doctrine of trying to give equal time to both sides, and it's even so rare in places like MSNBC and CNN that you have a real debate between someone on the right and someone on the left. They just don't seem to do that so much anymore. It's preaching to the choir, even in your more respectable venues. So, so we do need to think about repair.
Yeah, and sadly, I don't think it's just the media's fault, it's the public's fault, right? We're the consumers of it, and the media all too often gives us what we want. And so it falls back on deeper questions of education and civic education and all of that. Okay, let's turn to Q&A now. We've got a lot of questions, and I'm told that apparently the Q&A function was not working for a while, but it is working again. So if you tried to submit a question and it didn't work, go again. So our first question comes from Elena Chichester, a freshman here at AU in the Lincoln Scholars Program. And her question is whether you think the backlash and high levels of racialized resentment will continue to grow, and if more politicians similar to Trump will continue to be popular, or if Trump and the era of Trump is a blip.
Hold on, let me get my magic ball. You know, I wish I knew. So someone said historians have a hard enough time predicting the past, let alone the future. I'm not an historian, but you know, as hearing someone say, people were so bad at guess, you know, who guessed that Trump was going to win? I mean, there were a few, but there were darn few. We were all completely flummoxed by that, basically. People, you know, people laughed at the prospect of Trump as a candidate, let alone as president. So who knows? I do think he has some unique talents when it comes to communication, and so I would in some ways hope that he's a blip, but I'm not going to bet my mortgage on it. You know, I think appealing to class, appealing to inclusive interests. I think, you know, Biden was the strongest candidate because we need to appeal to the middle, and try to hear both sides. And so we'll see. I mean, you know, we'll see. I think there's a conflict going on in the Republican Party now that'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. But you know, the percentages of members of the Republican Party who still look to Trump as their leader and champion is quite high. I just think we hope that there'll be more leaders who will speak truth to power, as it were, on all sides of the spectrum, and that we should all applaud when they do.
Okay, our next question comes from Cheryl Chung, an exchange student at AU from the University of Toronto. Have there been data suggesting that Mexicans and other ethnic minorities who integrate into American culture receive greater social trust from the community? For instance, do immigrants like professionals in the Bay Area who do not promote multiculturalism, religion, ethnic celebrations, and diverge from the lifestyle of an American face less resentment?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. That might be the case. I just don't know. There is the only evidence I know related to that is that it's actually a former graduate student from Princeton, and I'm forgetting his name. Alexander Kustov, suggested there are kind of national rankings, and that there's very little resentment towards migrants from countries who are rated high on a scale, basically perceptions of their country's level of economic development. So if you're migrating from a country that's seen as, you know, as high on the level of socioeconomic development, Germany and so on, there's very little. And if you're rated lower in terms of Americans' perceptions of countries' levels of development, then that makes a big difference. But she's asking a different question about assimilation and so on, or I don't know, the keeping cultural ways. I don't know. It's possible, but I don't know the empirical evidence on that. You know, yeah, I just don't know. I would hope that we move towards a, you know, era in which people would see the maintenance of various kinds of cultural inheritances as something that enriches the country, rather than something that, you know, what we want people to do is to assimilate towards a belief in democracy and a belief in equal justice for all, and equal opportunity for all, and respect for all tolerant religions. Hopefully, yeah.
Between us and Canada, it really seems like there's a different presumption, right? So the racialized hostility you speak of towards immigrants in this country is when it's assumed that they're coming in an undocumented manner. And you mentioned earlier, if it's pointed out that no, that's not the case, then, oh, people's opinions change. And I assume that goes along with coming from a higher status country.
Yeah.
It means, okay, they earned their way here, right? And
and they're going to,
That's the presumption in Canada might be that latter thing, right? That is admitting people with skills, and everybody knows that that's the basis for immigration, generally speaking, right? Then people's attitudes are, oh, here's an immigrant, they must have some special skill.
That may well be. I believe they also do have some social tensions, and there are
Sure.
conservative parties in the West that are not pro-immigration. But there may be a somewhat difference in attitudes. There may be some difference in attitudes that goes along to some degree with that. I mean, I think it's the case that there has been this incredible violence towards Asian Americans and Asian immigrants that's been reported in the news recently, which is horrible, partly because of remarks about the Chinese flu and so on, evidently. But I do believe it's the case that that in general hostility towards Asian Americans and people from Asia is much lower than it was, and may have something to do with this kind of perceived international hierarchy that we've been discussing. Yeah.
Okay, the next question is from our friend Bill Galston.
Oh.
Some liberal nationalists, e.g. Tamir Miller, seem to argue in favor of limits to immigration and by extension to diversity. They do so in part for practical reasons that you've discussed here, but also because their own conceptions of national identity might have some ethnic dimensions. Do you think, on a moral level, liberal nationalists and liberals more broadly should aspire for quote unquote diversity? Or should they, like Tamir, more modestly aspire to encourage the ethnic majority plurality to be more respectful of minorities without challenging the majority plurality's ethnically laden conception of national identity?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and a very tough question from our friend Bill Galston, who I admire enormously, and I wish he was up here with me, and you, Alan. But one thing about this is that there's Israel is a special case. There are special reasons as to why Israel, as a haven for Jews from persecution, is entitled, I think, to maintain, at least has some entitlement to maintain, sort of at least as a pro tanto reason, not as a certain policies maybe that maintain a certain security for the Jewish population, and I don't think those reasons generalize across states. So I often feel as though people are making arguments that apply in the case of Israel that don't apply across states. So that, I'll just say that about that. That doesn't mean I have a particular view with the law of return and so on. There also needs to be fairness towards, much greater fairness towards Palestinian citizens and also towards Israeli Arabs and non-Jews generally. But so leaving that aside, and with Miller's case, yeah, it's a tough one. I don't think America is a polyglot society. America is an immigrant society. I don't see having. I mean, I don't think. I tend to think we should not have preferences based on culture. How would we do it? How could we have preferences based on cultural similarity, without being unfair to our own cultural minorities? We're such a culturally diverse country already. If we favor the majority culture, whatever that is in immigration, we would be thereby unfair to our minority cultures. Now, I think we've come to issues about beliefs that are inconsistent with liberalism, with liberal democracy. I mean, if there was, I think insofar as there's genuine evidence of particular migrants, and I wouldn't want to do this on a group basis, but that have possibly highly patriarchal views or intolerant views of some sort, that in itself, I think, is a legitimate basis for concern. But that should be an individualized belief-based assessment rather than a cultural assessment or even a group-based assessment. I don't think we should have any kind of prohibition on Muslim migrants, for instance, on that basis. So I guess in shaping these policies, we need to think about, partly we need to think about being fair to applicants to come in, but we also need to be fair and think about the other members of our hugely diverse community who may properly feel that cultural or ethnic or religious would properly feel preferences would be invidious from the standpoint of our own citizens who share those cultures, ethnicities, and so on. So I would say that this is my tendency, and if I would want to have a conversation with Bill about this, but that there could be some legitimate values-based concerns, but that they should be applied on an individual level, not on an ethnic or cultural or group-based level. That would be my initial response to that excellent question.
Okay, I think I have another question from Bill, and I'm not sure if that last one was from Bill.
Maybe I should stop praising him.
But here you go. I agree that for practical reasons, the 11 million should have a path to citizenship. But suppose that a philosophically minded opponent of this policy said this: consider the case of someone who squats in an apartment you own and refuses to leave. You appeal to political authorities in the courts without decisive results. The squatter pays you rent and contends that this suffices to entitle him to remain. Does he have a compelling justice-based or rights-based claim to stay? Or does his refusal to leave violate your right as a property owner to determine who occupies this property?
Darn good question, but I better not say that anymore else. I'll ask another one. But you have a good point there, and it's good to raise this question, and you raise it in a very good way, because we don't have this sort of conversation enough. We don't entertain this sort of question enough in universities because of the one-sidedness of so much of the professoriate on these and related questions. So it's a good question. I actually tend to agree with Michael Blake on this, who codes this or categorizes or frames this issue as an issue of mercy rather than an issue of justice. So for the reason that you've set out, Bill, people can have good reasons and ample reasons for violating entry laws. They can do it out of desperation. They can do it to help their family and so on. It becomes a question of whether we want to describe actual cases in the way you've described them. So, but as a rough and ready characterization, I would say one thing that's worth noting is that our moral obligations are not all obligations that come under the rubric of justice and rights. There are also moral obligations we have and duties we have that flow from mercy and humanity. And the fact is that the vast majority of these people that have come in, that have settled among us, become parts of our community, are integrated into our society. And their children were born here. So their children, many of the cases, the children have rights to be American citizens. And as Bill well knows, there are thousands, tens of thousands of American citizen children living in Mexico now because their parents have been deported. They've been uprooted. Many of them have been uprooted, having never lived in Mexico and maybe not even speaking Spanish. So the cost, the human costs here, quite apart from issues of legality, need to be taken into account. Rights and justice are not the be all and end all, morally speaking. And after all, what was the story about Jared Kushner's parents being non-legal or whatever it was? I mean, so many of the people came in. Of course, there weren't immigration restrictions, but in other cases, people have gotten around them in various ways. Many of our ancestors came in in these periods of when there were no restrictions in any case. And as I think it was Jeb Bush that put it in the 2016 primaries, that even the people that are seeking to get in undocumented are seeking it for the most morally admirable reasons, to help their families, to try to make a better life for their children and so on, and to come here and work. So look, that doesn't mean that migration restrictions are unjust or that we should have open borders, and it does mean that there's an element of ambiguity of the sort that Bill has put his finger on. But I would say that that the question can't be answered adequately simply on the basis of considering issues of justice and rights, but rather requires consideration of mercy and humanity. And there's also prudence. I mean, we're talking about 10 million, 11 million people. The amount of due process we'd have to have in order to export people would be, it doesn't even make any sense from a self-interested standpoint, though it does make some sense from a partisan standpoint, I suppose. But that's my basic question, is that it's not just a question of justice and rights, it's a question of mercy and humanity and benevolence.
Please go back up. Okay, so we have two more questions. We've hit the 7 o'clock hour, but we got a late start. So we're going to take two more questions. And the first one is from a friend of the Political Theory Institute, Martin Sitta. And it is this: is it not crucial to have a policy that can be enforced so that issues like the current one with illegal immigrants not arise again? Is there any chance that this can be accomplished by the current proposal?
Yeah, it's, I mean, we're probably always going to have porous borders. It seems certain. Possibly very likely, it seems, I think there's a fair amount of support for this e-verify system. You know, if we were to take it seriously, again, you'll get pushback from some conservatives and so on about having a national identity card and so on, and not wanting the government tracking you and so on and so forth. But e-verify was part of the 2013 immigration reform proposals, I believe, and that almost went through, except that Eric Cantor lost his seat and so on and so forth, and there was a kind of chain reaction in the House Republicans. But so I think e-verify would be helpful to help regulate this, and I do think it's, you know, we share a long border with a country, you know, through which people can travel, Mexico, with many poor people below that. So we're never going to have sealed borders, but I think we could do a lot better than we've done. The other thing is that you know, as Doug Massey points out, there were, for decades really, there were something like 1 million illegal migrants in the States who were here seasonally and who returned. And then, as part of the Reagan border security efforts, we tightened the borders. We made it much harder for some of those people to return seasonally and then come back. So they stayed, and eventually they stayed, and more of them came. And so, in a way, the large number of illegal people that we have had, or undocumented people that we have had within our political community, have been a consequence of disrupting a flow that was responsive to labor patterns that had a kind of naturalness to them. They'd gone along with the Bracero guest worker program earlier on. And we made the problem worse in a lot of ways through unenlightened border security policies. So we can't ignore we have to try to enact policies that are both humane, and e-verify would be a more humane way of doing it, putting the burden on employers, but they also are realistic and that provide some outlet for desperate people. So it's a tough. I mean, it's not an easy set of issues to address. But we can certainly do better, and I think e-verify would be part of it, and then more realistic and reasonable immigration policies and refugee policies to provide refuge for those who really are fleeing persecution, and then perhaps some aid and assistance and security assistance for Central American countries where there's this profound insecurity, violence, and disruption.
Okay, our last question from my colleague and partner in the Political Theory Institute, Tom Merrill. Is it possible to pass immigration reform without continuing the dangerous polarization of the country? Or will immigration reform inevitably be divisive? How should liberals speak to Trump's Democrats?
Yeah, well, that's a really tough one, because the ground has shifted since 2013, when though that compromise policy was passed the Senate and had Obama's approval, and then lost out in the House. So the ground has shifted, and it's a good question. I mean, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, John McCain was one of those, was in the Gang of Eight, I believe, and he's gone, and Rubio Cruz would no longer go for it, maybe. So it's a tough one. I mean, I'm not going to. The Republican primary process at the moment is a real national problem. Was it John Tierney in the New York Times? I forget who it was, or Patrick Egan or somebody talked about the open primary process as something that could sap some of the power of Republican extremists. Lisa Murkowski remains a senator because while she lost the Republican primary in Alaska, she was able to run as an independent, and now they have an open primary system there. So she doesn't really, she would be reelected even though she doesn't have the support of the majority of Republicans in their open primary system. That may be something that could help if it were adopted. But we have a real problem that a highly motivated, extreme segment of the population dominates one of our two major political parties. And, as people have said, our democracy cannot function unless it has two parties that have some level of reasonableness and comedy. And that this is an existential problem for the country, how this gets sorted out. I mean, myself, I feel like we have to welcome every Republican that opens a hand, Adam Kinzinger and so on. I don't care who he voted for in 2016 or 2020. I don't care what nice things he may have said about Trump, even a few months ago. If he's seen the light now, then I think he should be welcomed and encouraged. I heard Don Lemon the other day saying, "Hold on, we have to have accountability for the past for people like Adam Kinzinger." I think that's being way too confident about the political stability of our system. Anyway, I think it's a good question.
So you talk about welcoming, right? From a liberal point of view, welcoming the Kinzingers, right? But I'm just going to ask, and you talked about the political aspect of Tom's question, but his other question was, how should liberals speak to Trump's Democrats? And one of the great things about your work is you really try hard, I think, and sincerely to get into the mind, the complex mind and the complex interrelationship of motives and the world and all sorts of different things of those who are more crudely dismissed as the deplorables, right? So after having done this work to get into the mind of Trump's Democrats and even some Republicans, how would you talk to them to try to heal the nation, to create a bridge?
Yeah, I mean, I would just try to reach out to them on common ground, recognizing the importance of this class issue. I mean, I think the issue is not so much at the individual level, but at the structural level, the media level. The fact is that extending healthcare coverage to folks is something that's very much in their interest. But it is also is important, and Michael Sandel says this in his book on meritocracy, we do have to treat people with respect and recognize, I think, the cultural and psychological dislocations of those who have who have moved down their position in society, and be careful about reveling too much at their downfall. I think there is a tendency among some progressives to celebrate, in a way, the dethroning, as they would put it, of white working class males as the backbone of the country. I've heard people say they're tired of hearing these people complain, and I can sort of understand that to some extent. But I don't have any thoughts about this. But Adam Smith and David Hume and others said it's losing things that you've had is much more psychologically difficult than the positive that goes along with gaining things. And I think I think we've seen a lot of changes in our country very quickly, and I think to some degree some patience with some people's attitudes, and that we don't fully appreciate it. Some patience and some forgiveness when people make mistakes in speech, for example, not being quite so censorious to jump on people. And also, I think, looking for what's reasonable on the other side. I mean, just with Trump and his immigration policies, it wasn't crazy that people wanted greater border security. It wasn't crazy, of course, that he was concerned about trade with China. It's not the case that everything he was for was wrong. The way he went about many things was very bad. The way he went about border security was terrible with respect to family separation. But not everything that he was for was wrong. Labor unions were concerned about high levels of low-skilled migration. So I just think trying to look for the most reasonable part of this. I myself am in the middle, and grew up as a Reagan Republican, and worked for a Republican congressman from Texas for a while before going to grad school at Princeton. So I feel some of that ambivalence. But I do think we need to. I don't have any magic formula for it. I think one thing we should do is do more of what you're doing here at American University with this forum, and that's making sure. And I try to do this in the things that I run at Princeton. Try to make sure that we're inviting in reasonable conservatives and people on the other side, and encouraging on our campuses serious debate and discussion across the usual ideological lines, and not going with what can be a hyper progressive flow of people wanting to talk to other people who agree with themselves, agree with one another, and not wanting to discuss matters of serious disagreement.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with that. And thank you for your reasonable presentation today. And 25 years later, it's really nice to have you.
Alan, we're going to do it again in 25 years.
Yeah, let's plan on it.
That's right. Absolutely.
Okay.
So thank you so much. And thanks all folks. More comments, please send them my way. Macedo@princeton.edu. I would love to hear from you. Thank you.
And thank you everybody for coming. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Alan.
Bye, Steve.